You're listening to Colorado Chamber Office Hours, a podcast that explores what matters most to business. I'm your host, Ed Sealover, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and editor of the Sum and Substance. Let's get talking. Welcome back, everyone. And please put on your scuba gear, because today we are going to do a deep dive into the weeds on a wonky but very important rulemaking by the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission that took place about a week and a half ago. An effort this podcast is making in part to explain to you why it's not just the 4 months of legislating that's important for your business owners to watch, but also the year-round rulemaking that is usually divested to appointed boards by the legislators in those same bills that we spend so much time talking about. In this case, the rulemaking surrounds the GEMM 2 program, a lovely acronym for the Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Energy for Manufacturing program that was set up through a 2021 law. Colorado, you see, is the first state in the nation to set up mandatory emissions reduction mandates specifically for the manufacturing sector. And its rules apply to the 21 largest manufacturers in Colorado. Everyone from Suncor to Molson Coors to the natural soda baking soda plant located in remote Garfield County. Each of these facilities is given either a mandate to reduce their total emissions or a mandate to reduce their emissions intensity by a certain amount by 2030 as compared to their 2015 emissions levels. This is part of the state's bigger picture efforts to cut air pollution, which also has led to mandates on sectors ranging from oil and gas to commercial buildings to lawn and garden equipment even. The good news, folks, is that the sector already has exceeded its 2030 goal of 20% emissions reductions, having achieved 23.5% cuts in greenhouse gas emissions by last year. But that doesn't mean it's stopping, especially as state officials are expecting in coming years to come back with post-2030 emissions cut goals for a number of sectors. The rulemaking hearing held by the AQCC on July 16th and 17th regarding this program pertains specifically to a key way that facilities will achieve emissions goals, both now and in the future, through credit trading markets. These are markets that companies that exceed their goals can go to sell credits for going above and beyond their goals as a financial reward, if you will, for their efforts. And companies that have not hit their goals can buy those credits to help reach their goals. To explain both the importance of these markets and what happened in the rulemaking that we're focused on this month, we have John Jacus, an attorney at Davis Graham and an expert in the energy field, who is a member of the Colorado Chamber Foundation Board and participated in the hearing on behalf of one of his other clients. John, thank you for talking with us today.
My pleasure, Ed. Always glad to talk with you about our favorite Air Quality Control Commission.
Yes, John and I have had a lot of conversations about this. And John, I attempted just a little bit to describe what went on over the 2 days that enraptured both you and I and a good dozen other people, but that affected everybody in the state of Colorado, it seems. Could you explain a little bit about what this rulemaking was all about and why we were re-examining the credit trading markets for the GEMM 2 program?
Well, sure, I'm happy to do that. This began really as a holdover from the original rulemaking in 2023 that was implementing the first regulations, regulation number 27 of the Air Commission, to implement provisions of the Environmental Justice Act, on which it is based. A third compliance pathway besides actually making emission reductions at your facility, the covered GEMM 2 facilities, or selling or buying credits as needed to meet your compliance goals. If you can't make enough reductions, there aren't enough cost-effective reductions below the social cost of carbon, then Reg 27, as originally adopted until amended on the 17th by the Commission, it allowed for the purchase of credits. For some facilities will not have cost-effective emission reduction projects available to them. It's just a fact. And these facilities are a wide range of manufacturing businesses, as you mentioned. I mean, everything under the sun of a certain size that emits CO2 and other greenhouse gases in sufficient quantity is going to be subject to GEMM 2. So those were the two primary ways. because it was brand new, industry, the regulated community, was concerned that if there weren't enough credits and they weren't able to implement and effectuate sufficient on-site greenhouse gas emission reductions, then they would be out of compliance. They would simply have to go out of business or scale back their production to meet the lower CO2 emissions limit imposed by the regulation. That would drive business out of Colorado. It would result in a paper reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It would simply export jobs and goods and services out of Colorado, and it wouldn't help the climate. It would just hurt the economy. So having what was loosely referred to as a fee fund, a fund into which a company that couldn't do on-site reductions and couldn't buy enough credits could pay into that fund, and that fund would then be available to help decarbonize other parts of the industrial and manufacturing sector as required by the Environmental Justice Act. That did not get passed in 2023 by the then Air Commission, but they asked the division to come back to them in 2025 and to propose creating that third compliance pathway, a fee fund, or what the division did develop, they called the SCARF, which was an acronym for
something air relief fund. Yes, I've forgotten this one by now too.
It was a credit. It was a fund, of, and I don't recall the meaning of the acronym, but it had all kinds of other aspects to it that really were not contemplated by industry back in 2023. And it clearly revealed an intent on the part of the Air Division to not only look into the future, but actually to manipulate the market, to put their thumb on the scale of the market. Maybe there are too many credits and they'll want to just retire some people's credits to make sure that the market has what they think is a sufficient price, where these were things that were not contemplated in 2023. We are way ahead of the 20% sector-wide requirement to reduce emissions by 20%, as you just pointed out. So industry responded to this proposal for a SCARF fund by saying, that goes well beyond anything we contemplated. We don't know that you have statutory authority to do that. And we certainly don't need it now because we've got plenty of credits and we're way ahead of schedule in our emission reductions. So let's table that. They took that off the table and proceeded, though. They wanted to make a number of changes, definitional changes, GHG market changes, how you address underreporting and maybe the issuance of credits that should not have been issued. Many of these finer points of administering a market for credits in Colorado were addressed on the 16th and 17th by the Air Commission. So that hopefully answers your first question.
Yeah, it does. And I don't think we're going to dive into quite the level of what do each of these changes do. There's some that are important to talk about. But I want to pull you back out a second and let's just talk about the idea of credits, period, because this is actually still a little bit of a controversial idea as we see through the hearing. As you mentioned, the first way that these manufacturing facilities can lower their emissions is making changes on site, bringing in newer machines, maybe electrifying some things that are gas powered now, et cetera, et cetera. That's not realistic in most businesses' mind. Is the only way to hit their limits, though. So you've got this secondary plan with credits for businesses that go above and beyond. They get credits. For businesses not quite getting there, they don't get credits. Some environmental groups have said, look, we don't like the credit idea because it lets you buy your way out of hitting your limits. And I think there's been particularly criticism of the Suncor plant because of this, a plant that is making a lot of changes, but is having to buy credits to reach its limits. Can you explain why this whole credit market is so important to the state achieving its emission goals and actually keeping businesses in business?
I can do my best. I'm a student of credit markets as well, and I'm learning as we've developed this program in Colorado. I know enough to be dangerous about other credit markets. Let me just start by saying it's an old and tired criticism of market-based regulatory systems that you're just letting the polluter pay. You're buying your way out of compliance. This has been proven, false since the acid rain program in the 70s and 80s was created under the Clean Air Act, which was wildly successful. You're letting market efficiencies obtain the desired results across the economy or the nation or any jurisdiction. We're trying to do that in Colorado with Regulation 27. So if I can't identify any projects that are at all cost effective at my plant and I've got to reduce emissions, what am I going to do besides reduce production or move out of the state, which is counterproductive? Everybody agrees, and the original commission passing Reg 27 agreed that leakage, as it's known, of emissions and jobs and goods and services out of the jurisdiction into neighboring states does not help the climate.
Neighboring states that may have less regulations than Colorado, it should be mentioned.
Exactly. So whether it's, making wallboard or, cheese or refining hydrocarbons for fuel, you don't want that to just move. The whole point of the program is to actually reduce emissions and to keep a healthy economy. And that's the balance, and it's tricky. So market-based regulatory systems can be very good, but there's a balance to be struck. And we saw the commission struggling with some of those balances, like the almost never-ending call for transparency by environmental groups. They want to see everything, whether they use it effectively for some good purpose or not. And that means long-term contracts, which was a big issue in the rulemaking. Should they see private long-term contracts for the purchase and sale of credits? To what end? Won't that chill participation and involvement in such contracts and disincentivize participation in the market? I think industry's rightfully concerned about that, and it came through in their testimony at the hearing.
And that was one of the areas where the commission weighed in and said, no, we don't need public exposure of the details of these long-term contracts. I think there were two really key principles that came out of this. I want to ask you about each of them. First of all, there was the principle of, can companies that go to these credit trading markets, can the many Colorado companies that are earning these credits, sell them outside the state if the market runs out here in the state? And there's some questions about that, and the commission came in with a resounding yes, they can. Why is that important? And are we really going to start seeing markets develop for interstate sales of these types of credits?
Well, there's an important distinction I want to make first in your question, Ed.
Yeah, please.
And it has to do with emission reductions, which are made by covered facilities. Let's say GEMM 2 facilities. There's 17 of them. When you do an emission reduction, that's your reduction. You've done it. You own whatever benefit might come of it. And if you're not turning that into a credit in Colorado, let's say you've already made the reductions you need to comply, or you purchased, generated and retired credits appropriately, but you've got more reductions than you need credits, you don't need to turn those into credits in the Colorado market. The reg is quite clear that if it's a Colorado credit, it stays in the Colorado market. But the emission reduction can be used in other markets. There are voluntary carbon markets. Nation states, corporations meeting climate goals will buy those credits so long as they are verified. And you'd have third-party verifiers and firms that specialize in that verify the reductions, and then they would purchase those credits for whatever they go for in those voluntary or regulatory markets. So we're not saying that Colorado credits could be used outside Colorado. The reg is pretty clear about that. But when you go beyond what you need for credits, if you can monetize your emission reduction, you want to use them for your own benefit, meet your own climate goals, and show that in black and white in a climate report to your shareholders and your leadership, that's fine. If you want to monetize those in an external market, also fine. That's what the commission was addressing in terms of the double counting provision, or what they called the waterfall provision during the hearing.
And just so nobody's confused here, John mentioned there are 17 GEM 2 facilities. There are also 4 what are called GEM 1 facilities. I am not going to get into the difference between them. Those were discussed too, but those are our cement plants, our steel plants, some of the bigger plants here in the state.
Yes.
The second thing that I think came loud and clear through this was a discussion about carbon capture and storage. And there was some environmental groups have long opposed this practice, saying this is not true emissions reduction. The commission came through in a way and said, yeah, it is. And by the way, if you do carbon capture and storage, you can count it towards your emissions reductions as a manufacturing facility. First of all, for those who are not initiated with it, what is carbon capture and storage, John?
Well, basically, if you've got a source of CO2, it could be from a combustion exhaust where you scrub the other pollutants out and you have a relatively pure CO2 remaining. But more typically, and this is common across the United States right now, certain kinds of biofuel and biological processing plants, and typically like ethanol plants, where you're fermenting corn or some other plant product to create ethanol. That's generating biogenic CO2. It's biogenic CO2 as opposed to, say, geologic CO2 coming out of, geologic storage of fossil fuels in the ground for however long they've been down there. That's introducing new CO2 to the atmosphere. The CO2 coming out of corn was sequestered by the plant when photosynthesis created the plant. And then when you ferment it, you're just letting it go back into the atmosphere, and then it comes back around again as you grow more plants. It's like the hydrologic cycle. Water becomes vapor, rain falls, it goes into the rivers and streams, and then it evaporates and becomes clouds and vapor again. That cycle is at the surface of the earth and touches and becomes part of the atmosphere. So it's not really a net gain of CO2 when you ferment corn and create ethanol. But ethanol manufacturers have a really pure CO2 stream coming off of their fermentation tanks that is very well suited to injection for sequestration. And then they can produce an ethanol product, typically for a fuel additive, and it makes those fuels less carbon intense, which is a good thing and advances the goals of decarbonization.
And so I think we know how you're going to answer this, but I'm going to follow that first question up with the second one here. Should we be allowing carbon capture and storage for an emissions reduction technique? There are still some who say, "Look, this is unproven." It sounds like you're saying no. This is needed, and
it's not only needed; it's very well proven. It's 50, 60, 70-year-old technology. The oil and gas sector has used CO2 to flood formations, reservoirs of hydrocarbons, to enhance oil production from them for decades safely. Pipelines, compression, they put it into what's called critical phase, and then they pump it into the ground. It makes the hydrocarbon in the reservoir less viscous, so it moves better with the critical phase CO2. And they do it in such a way, in a geometric design, so that injection wells force the fluids toward producing wells, and you have a network of injectors and producers in either a water flood or a CO2 flood, both of which are enhanced oil recovery techniques, very well proven, done without any incident for many years. So, and then the other thing is, we heard at the hearing too, and in full disclosure here, I represent a client that has got a project that is about to get a Class 6 permit and authorization to inject for their Class 6 well, a CO2 carbon sequestration well in Colorado. Don't want anyone to be, misled in that regard. But it's very well proven technology. The Class 6 regulations are the most stringent of any underground injection control program, administered exclusively by EPA unless and until they delegate a program authority for regs that are at least as stringent as theirs. That will be the case here in Colorado when EPA Region 8 delegates that Class 6 program to the Energy and Carbon Management Commission later this year.
And John, lastly here, I promised listeners we would not get into the gory details of the hearing, but we've talked big picture here. In the end, what's come out of this hearing? Do you feel like the GEMM 2 program, the one that is aimed at reducing emissions from manufacturing plants, is on good footing after this? Have things changed, or are we still in the right direction here?
I think the regulated community should feel pretty good about the outcome of the recent hearing, the Reg 27 hearing. It was a difficult proceeding in many respects. It was characterized as just sort of a cleanup and clarification rulemaking after that SCARF fund was tabled and not part of the rulemaking. That meant for a more narrow scope, that we weren't going beyond cleanup and clarification of what was trying to be done originally. And that's why certain alternate proposals that were advanced by various parties at the hearing were deemed out of scope. It was intentionally supposed to be a cleanup rulemaking, but it reached so many fundamental terms and definitions and how to correct errors and administratively cancel credits when there's been underreporting and things of that nature, that it became quite complex, even though it was supposed to be a narrow scope of rulemaking. I think that important work was largely achieved to the satisfaction of the division who proposed the cleanup and clarification. And I think the regulated community got much of what it wanted. Not everything, and they never do. I would like to also thank the division for all the outreach and collaboration. We were able to narrow the issues on which we didn't agree going into the hearing. We resolved many, like the long-term contracts issue, actually. We agreed with the division before we went into hearing. Unfortunately, other parties wanted to resurrect the original long-term contracts language, and that was a big issue at the hearing. So just because we reach agreement with the Air Division doesn't mean the matter is over. There are other parties who can be heard by the commissioners, and they might be swayed by them. So,
well, John Jacus, thank you for coming in and talking to us about these important matters that go before the Air Pollution Control Division and the Air Quality Control Commission that most Coloradans don't know about, but that's going to affect their air quality and, frankly, their ability to get jobs in this state. Thanks for the conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That's all for this episode of Colorado Chamber Office Hours. Once again, I'm Ed Sealover, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and editor of the Sum and Substance. I'll keep the conversation going at tsscolorado.com, and we'll see you next time as we explore the issues that matter most to business.